Okay, this is segment 1B for motivation and emotion, and we pick up with hunger and the role of the stomach. Receptors in the stomach send information to the brain on how much food and how many calories the stomach holds. A stomach full of salad is not as satisfying as a stomach full of steak, and it knows the difference. Now we move on to other things that affect hunger, and we take a look at external triggers. These can also cause hunger. Even seeing food or smelling it can do this. Examples are the palatability or taste of food, the quantity of food that's available. The more food that's there, the more you tend to eat. In fact, people tend to eat 44% more when eating with others. The variety of food, you will get adapt to food, and so that perhaps some of your favorite foods will not remain your favorite foods as you basically get bored with them. Comfort eating and nervous hunger suppression can occur as well. Again, the more the people involved in eating with you and the longer the time of the meal, the more you tend to eat. So now we move on to cultural and social norms that can affect hunger. Some examples of how cultural and social norms can affect hunger in rather extreme ways include anorexia. People are considered to be anorexic if they have a BMI below 18.5. People that suffer from this illness actually see fat that is not actually there on their bodies, and it becomes something that they really can't control. Some of you probably have some familiarity with some of the symptoms, perhaps friends or others. It is actually the disease that has the highest mortality rate for any mental disorder, according to the current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in Psychology, the DSM-5. Often connected with it is bulimia. In this situation, the people who suffer from this often binge, then purge, and there are many problems that are involved here. The purging itself is often a big problem. The stomach acid that they bring up as a result of the purging will eat away at the esophagus. It actually eats away at their teeth. Sometimes they'll abuse laxatives, and this can affect all kinds of issues in your digestive tract, obviously, and even your heart. So these are pretty negative things, and they're based on cultural ideas, at least in the beginning. Now, obesity seems to be increasing as well, and we find weightism in our society. We all know the negatives that people often connect to overweight appearance, and it's because of a social norm that we've created about what people are supposedly supposed to look like, which hopefully you've received quite a bit of instruction on how those ideals are rarely things that anyone actually achieves. Even the people you see who seem to have those are oftentimes not what they might seem. But it's the images that advertising and the media bring to us. Now, on a little side note, thirst works pretty much the same way hunger does. There's two regulators of thirst. One of them monitors the fluid inside the cells. The other monitors the fluids outside of the cells. And anytime there is a necessity to increase the fluids, then thirst will be created. But the environment, just like in hunger, can actually create thirst. And so there's a lot of correlations there between the two. They haven't been studied quite as much as weight or as hunger, but it definitely has been studied. We move on now to food, fat, and genetics, some random points. Humans do have some innate taste preferences. We really kind of focus on sweet taste at birth. Babies will do this. A preference for high-fat food appears to be partly based on our genetics, and we have an unlearned preference or genetic for salt that seems to develop around age 4 months. Salt obviously is very important in allowing our neurons to fire. Overall, our taste preferences are partly a function of learned associations through classical conditioning. A good example of this is taste aversion, the idea we talked about earlier about how if there's a food that once you really liked and you happen to eat it and become ill, your brain will make that connection with only one pairing, which is pretty interesting. Learned factors also affect how much we eat. So let's take a look very briefly at stress and eating. Many people, in fact most, fall prey to stress eating. Some researchers believe that it's the physiological arousal created by stress that prompts the eating itself. So it's the cranking up of the system due to stress, and the system then looking for something to fulfill what it considers its need for energy that prompts the eating that some people call stress eating. But the exact impact of stress on eating is not totally agreed upon by researchers. Now, moving on, let's take a look at obesity in general. What is it? Like most things, there's a disagreement, but one indicator is through something called the BMI, or body mass index. The way that this is calculated is that you take a person's weight in kilograms divided by their height in meters and then square that number. This controls for height. So what BMI is considered to be obese? Well, if a BMI of 25 is a cutoff, then 2/3 of Americans are actually struggling with their weight. A BMI of 25 to 29 is typically regarded as overweight, and a BMI of 30 is considered to be on the obese side. Now, overweight people are more vulnerable to a host of pathologies: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, respiratory problems, gallbladder disease, stroke, arthritis, muscle and skeletal pain, and some types of cancer. So this is why being obese, beyond something that may not culturally be positive for the person, is something that definitely needs to be treated or dealt with, because it really does put a ton of pressure on all the systems physiologically, and can also take a toll psychologically as a result. Well, now let's move on to what many people are very interested in, and that is diets. How do they work? What works? At any given time, about 20 to 40% of U.S. women are dieting. Today's treatments don't aim at an ideal weight, which is kind of interesting, but instead have been replaced with more moderate goals that turn out to be more reasonable and actually make the possibility of having success something much more attainable. A few facts concerning weight: adoptees resemble their biological parents more than their adopted parents. Identical twins raised apart are more similar in BMI than fraternal twins who are raised together. And overall, some people seem to inherit a genetic predisposition to obesity. But the thing we're going to look at here as far as dieting deals with something called the set point. And this is the idea that when one's fat cell level slips below your genetic or behavioral set point, your body responds by slowing your metabolism. The key then to a successful diet is to not try to push this set point too hard, because if you push it one way or the other, decrease your amount of food or increase your amount of food, if you push hard enough, it's going to push back just as hard in the opposite direction. And this is why crash diets tend not to work. What happens is that when somebody goes on a crash diet, their system really responds as if it's in panic mode, and not only does all it can to add the weight back, but then once that has occurred, in a sense, it says to itself, we don't know whether we're going to run into this emergency situation again, so we're going to pack on some extra pounds in order to deal with what might happen again. So a truly successful diet is one that is not a yo-yo diet that goes up and down, but instead is one where there's a gradual lifestyle change and you can slowly move the set point. Unfortunately for all of us, how far the set point can move in any one direction is somewhat limited by our genetics, but in essence what you can do if you diet correctly is make yourself be the best you can possibly be. Now, in looking at motivation, we'll spend quite a bit of time in class coming up on looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We've talked about it to some extent already, but we're going to go ahead and move beyond that for this video. So let's move on to some other things that might motivate us, including what are called stimulus motives. That's an unlearned motive that prompts us to explore or change the world around us. Some examples: curiosity, exploration, manipulation, and contact. So we seem to be motivated by these particular things as human beings. Now, curiosity, which we all seem to have to some extent, is an attempt by our brain to find out what's going on around us. Animals tend to show this as well. William James, the early psychologist, viewed curiosity as an emotion. Freud saw it as an expression of the sex drive, of course. Others see it as an attempt by humans to try and make some sense of life and give it meaning. But there's no question that we tend to be curious. No true link has been provided between curiosity and IQ, but there is one that's been found between creativity and curiosity, which is interesting as well. There is also some correlation between curiosity and adaptation. In other words, we adapt to our environment, thus we can become kind of bored and restless and curious. Now, moving on, another thing that tends to be a motivator is manipulation. And a good example of this is the reason that we have to have the sign on everything at the museum that says "Do not touch." Why do we want to touch it? We get more information. It actually seems to be a human motive to touch things. Manipulation is limited to primates, and we have fingers and toes. But primates will also involve their entire body in trying to contact things in order to gain more information. An offshoot of the contact motivation is shown here in a very famous experiment by the researcher Harry Harlow, where he took baby monkeys who were separated from their mothers at a very young age, and they were occasionally allowed to have contact with surrogate mothers. You see the two different surrogate mothers that each baby was allowed to have contact with. Now, these baby monkeys were raised with only a small amount of food, so they were pretty hungry. But in almost all cases, when put in a situation where these surrogate mothers were available, the baby monkeys would climb upon the terry cloth for the comfort that it seemed to give. Closeness goes deeper than the warmth that might be available. Both surrogates are warmed, but the terry cloth wire mesh, the terry cloth surrogate mother gave more comfort. And we could extrapolate to premature babies and contact, which we saw early on in the course in the fill video. So in essence, the baby turns down food for the contact comfort. What of aggression as a motive? Definition is all behavior that is intended to inflict physical or psychological harm on others. Intent is the key element here. Why are people aggressive? According to Freud, he saw it as an innate drive similar to hunger or thirst that builds up until it has to be released. And of course, it's released through defense mechanisms that are acceptable. But if Freud is right, releasing aggression should decrease aggressive drive, but research doesn't always support the idea that once someone is aggressive, that they won't be aggressive for a long time. So, is aggression based on evolution? One theory is that pain or frustration trigger aggression. Obviously, there's a connection between the two, but frustration doesn't always produce aggression. Bandura says frustration tends to breed aggression only in people who have learned to use it as a coping strategy. This, of course, is social learning. Think of the Bobo doll experiment. So how do we learn to be aggressive? According to Bandura, just seeing violence makes it more likely, and we saw that in his Bobo doll experiment. What about aggression and culture? Cultures vary in how they respond to aggression, and that, of course, influences how much aggression exists. Some cultures condone it, others punish it. In reality, collectivist cultures tend to tolerate less and actually have less violence than individualistic cultures. Gender and aggression. Males are in every category are more likely to be aggressive than females. So is this based on gender, or is it biological or social? The answer is mixed. Testosterone is one influence, obviously. Some researchers see aggression as evolutionary and related to our ancestors' ability to defend themselves, but there is social reinforcement of prescribed gender roles of aggression. Bottom line, it's a combination of nature and nurture. Now we move on to another motive, which is achievement, or the desire to achieve for one's own sake. We take a look here at one test that's often used. It's abbreviated WOFO, the Work and Family Orienting and Achievement Scale. There are three separate but interrelated aspects to this test: your work orientation, your mastery of things, and your competitiveness. Lots of information comes from this testing through this particular test. And what this test shows is that a high degree of competitiveness may actually interfere with someone's ability to achieve. Why does this happen? Experts believe highly competitive people may alienate those who might help them achieve beyond what they do otherwise. Others suggest that preoccupation with competition distracts from efforts necessary to attain their goals, but testing gives the following as a profile of people with high achievement motivation. They tend to be fast learners, like challenges, try to live up to a high self-imposed standard of performance, and be self-confident. But they can be stressed and have some problems dealing with success. That's the end of 1B. We now move on to motivation.